Welcome to today's lesson on the French defense Winawer advanced variation.
It must be noted that the ideas tend to vary somewhat greatly depending on which specific variation of the Winawer we consider, as there are quite different ways the opening can continue after the opening moves, particularly the pawn from e4 to e5. For instance,
Black has three main ways to continue, such as queen d7, knight e7, and pawn to c5.
So the game starts with e4, e6, d4, d5, the French defense, knight c3, bishop b4, and the move pawn from e4 to e5. That is the key move, allowing white to fight for an advantage from the very opening.
Now looking at this from Black's perspective, after e4, e6, d4, pawn to d5, knight c3, bishop b4, pawn to e5. Let's consider first the move c7 to c5. What's the continuation? The continuation is pawn to a3, and after a3, the bishop will capture the knight on c3. White recaptures. Let's make an evaluation.
I'm going to ask a question first. What is the true test of this variation? First of all, the pawn structure favors black in this game. Why? Because white has an isolated a pawn on a3 and doubled c pawns on the c file. On the other hand, white does have the two bishop advantage. However, it is a static or long-term advantage. So could the true test be black's pawn structure, which is good for the endgame, versus white's static advantage of having two bishops? Black has two weaknesses so far that I can point out here, is that the dark square bishop has been traded off, and also the knight is prevented from developing to its natural square on f6. First, considering black's best move on move 6, knight e7. And now three main ways for white to continue are pawn to h4, pawn to a4, and queen to g4. So after this opening setup, let's look at pawn to h4. The idea here is that black wants to go to f5, putting pressure on white's pawn on d4. And the idea is that after h4, if the knight does move to f5, then white can follow up with pawn from g2 to g4, kicking the knight from the f5 square. The move pawn to a4, the idea behind this move is to play the bishop from c1 to a3, putting pressure on the a3 to f8 diagonal. This exploits the fact that black's dark square bishop is missing. And the move queen g4 is an early attack on black's king side, targeting the pawn on g7.
You know what? I'm going to get some expert advice. I'm going to go to a GM and ask if there are any alternatives or other ideas for black, or measures that can be taken on black's behalf. I'm going to ask Grandmaster Scott. Here's Grandmaster Scott.
Well, okay, yeah, Let's consider the alternative move, queen to a5, a preventative measure black can take against white's plan to play a4. So from the starting position after c5, we have pawn to a3, there's a trade on c3, and instead of knight e7, black can play queen a5. This puts pressure on white's pawn on c3. So the preventative move, and after the following, the queen will go to a4 and the pawn on a3 is fixed, preventing a4. Not only is the queen blockading the pawn, but is well established to initiate counterattacks on the queen side and in the center. Now this is of course in reference to the alternative sixth move for black. So we have e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop e4, e5, c5, a3, capture. And now we have the move, the sixth move for black, which is knight to e7. Now we're back into the main line continuation. And from here, there are three main moves for white, and those moves are pawn to a4, pawn to h4, and queen g4. The first one we're going to look at is queen to g4. Following this move, black has the option of playing the poison pawn variation. The idea is to sacrifice the g7 pawn in quicker development, and for queenside castling.
And here's how the line might continue. Knight on b to c6, queen takes g7, rook g8, queen takes h7 and queen c7. Bishop d3, there's a capture on d4, and after the recapture, knight captures on d4, white develops the bishop to b2, and now queen b6. Queenside castle, bishop d7, pawn to h4, black castles queenside, and knight f3. And the idea is to pressure white's king. If white goes to the queen side, then the black will play the king over to b8, etc. And now looking at pawn to h4, queen c7, knight f3, b6, and this is a possible continuation.
Is there anything you would like to add, Grandmaster Scott?
Well, I just want to add that as a whole, the Winawer can be a very dynamic weapon to play for a win, as it can lead to highly imbalanced positions. For instance, after black's sixth move, knight to e7, and white reply is pawn to a4. Now I'm just going to go quickly, just so you can see. f6 to detest white's pawn on e5, bishop d6, queen d8, and there's a trade on f6. And notice how white's bishop is beautifully placed on the b8 to h2 diagonal. Keep in mind that with black's dark square bishop being absent from the board, the dark squares could become a problem for black. If, for example, black is unable to create a clear counterplay and white manages to force further dark square weaknesses on the king's side, then white's queen and dark square bishop coordination could become dominant and decisive.
Okay, and let's conclude this video with a Petrosian variation. That comes after black's fourth move, queen to d7. Would you like to elaborate, Grandmaster Scott?
The Trojan variation starting from black's fourth move, queen d7, looks really dubious at first, but it's a multi-purpose move. First, it prevents white from playing bishop to b5 because black could just capture the knight on c3 is pinned. The other thing that queen d7 does is that it prepares to play the pawn from b7 to b6, followed by bishop a6. But should white play the queen to g4, then f5 would be what I call a discovered defense.
Okay, thank you, Grandmaster Scott. Appreciate you. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for my next video.